Hello, Alex here, and in this video I want to talk about replacing the stock focusing screen in my Yashica Mat 124G with a much brighter and clearer third-party screen, including talking about calibration and shimming to get the focusing just right. Let's get into it. The Yashica Mat 124G is an amazing camera and a real joy to use, but the stock focusing screen is frankly pretty bad. I had borrowed one from a friend before I picked up mine, so I knew that I would eventually be replacing the screen. The standard focusing screen is a two-part affair where the ground glass is not super bright or clear, but it doesn't have a focusing aid in the center. There's no micro prism and no split prism, and the Fresnel or Fresnel lens is a piece of plastic that darkens in yellows over time. In my case, it just got darker, not super yellow, but those two things together result in a fairly low contrast and relatively dim viewfinder, especially compared to most other medium format cameras that make it quite hard to achieve critical focus, again, at least under dimmer conditions, closer focusing distances and wider apertures. But still, it doesn't make for a great overall experience. Replacing the stock focusing screen is quite an involved process and involves quite a bit of disassembly of the camera, and in many people's cases it will require shimming to calibrate your infinity focus. At the time I did this, my neighbors were having some construction work done, so I wasn't able to actually record voiceover at the time. So if the whole tutorial seems a bit choppy and disjointed, that's because it is, but it took quite a while for me to dial this in. Because I was a bit of an outlier, as we'll see. So I'm not going to undo it just so I can re-record with fresh voiceover, which I think is fair. Aside from the camera itself, you'll need your new focusing screen and a screwdriver, ideally with a narrow handle. A rocket blower and gloves are helpful, but aren't absolutely required. I left mine in for demonstration, but you should remove the battery because when we remove the focusing hood, the meter will turn on and stay on. To do this, we have to remove the focusing hood, and there are 4 screws attaching it to the body, so the first step is to undo those. This is easiest if you open up the hood, which will give you just a smidge more clearance because it is a little bit tight. This gold post here on the left inside of the body feels the presence of the focusing hood, and when pressed forwards, it turns the meter off. So remove the hood with a sort of scooping motion to make sure you clear that post and don't damage it. Once the hood is removed, flip it over and you can see the focusing screen attached to the underside. Over time, the mirror does get a bit dirty, so give it a gentle clean without touching it. Here you can see the notch at the front of the focusing screen, as well as the spring clips that push the screen up from below, and the hood springs that snap the hood open and shut. I'm using a driver bit rather than my nail for visibility, but pop the hood spring out of its little latch and lift it out and then repeat on the other side. Do note that there are left and right springs and they can't be swapped over. Using a flat tool, depress the spring clip and slide it either forwards or backwards to release it, being careful not to let go too quickly and have it fly across the room because it is a spring, before repeating on the other side. Unlike the hood springs, these are identical and fit on either side and you can't mix them up. At this point, the focusing screen should just pop out, but mine didn't, so I had to flex the side panels of the hood a little bit to pass those clips that the 2 different springs fit into. Here you can see the 2 parts of the stock focusing screen, the Fresnel or Fresnel lens that helps with overall illumination and vignetting in the corners, and the actual ground glass. In my case, I'm using a Rick Olsen focusing screen, which will replace both of these, so you don't put the Fresnel under the new focusing screen. Before installing the new focusing screen, make sure you're 100% sure which side is which. The frosted side is usually the underside, which will face the lens. So because we're installing this on the bottom of the focusing hood, the frosted side needs to face upwards for installation so it faces downwards inside the camera. In my case, I also have a micro prism, so the actual convex surface of the micro prism faces upwards and I can feel that with my glove. With the notch facing forwards and taking extreme care not to scratch it, slide the new focusing screen into place. Next, reinstall the spring clips in the same way they were removed. Here is where I want to talk about focus shimming and calibration. The focusing screen is pushed upwards from below against the frame, so a thicker focusing screen will have its underside sitting slightly lower than the stock screen, and a thinner focusing screen will have its underside facing or lying slightly higher. So if the focusing screen is not in exactly the same position as the stock screen, its focal plane will not match that of the taking lens, which is why you might need to install shims, as you'll see I had to. You can open the hood now, but without the hood springs, it won't snap open and closed properly. The springs themselves come along the underside of the screen on the inside of these side panels, up to these front corners, outwards, and then upwards. When installing the hood springs, make sure that they set into this notch in the corner and then gently push them into the latch on the side panel to put tension on them. Once you've installed both hood springs, just open and close the focusing hood a few times to make sure you've installed them properly and it snaps open and closed in the normal way. Remembering to make sure to clear the power switch for the meter, reinstall the focusing hood with a scooping motion like before, pop it open, and then reinstall the 4 screws that attach it to the camera body. At this point, do a quick check to make sure that opening and closing the hood properly switches the light meter on and off. Now you can happily have a proper look through the finder and see how much of a difference your new focusing screen makes. To check your focus accuracy, focus on something at infinity. If it's in sharp focus, you're fine. If your viewing lens focus is closer than infinity, you need to add shims between the hood and the focusing screen to move the underside of the focusing screen downwards. And if your lens focus is beyond infinity, you need to add shims between the focusing hood and the body itself to move the focusing screen upwards. In my case, the screen alone wasn't even focusing to about 20 meters, let alone infinity, so I took the whole thing apart again to install the shims that were provided with the Rick Olsen screen. The Rick Olsen shims are adhesive, so it's just a case of sticking them to the hood, reinstalling the screen and clips, and reattaching the hood to the camera again. At this point it seemed okay, but it actually wasn't quite right, and every photo on my next couple of rolls was back focused, with the photos shot further away affected the most, so I had to go back and add a couple of layers of electrical tape to the provided shims to thicken them just a smidge, and everything is perfectly dialed in now. So this is definitely not just a 60-second drop-in job like something like a Hasselblad or an RB67 or the SL66. It's quite a bit more involved, and if you're comfortable tinkering with your gear, it's probably like a 10 to 15 minute job at the most, assuming you don't need to calibrate your infinity focus and do test rolls. From what I understand, talking to the folks who make the Rick Olsen bright screens, I'm a bit more of an outlier compared to most people who can just drop in the replacement screen or drop it in with the included shims. You know, tolerances in manufacturing vary, and maybe my frame is a little bit bigger, or their screen is the screen I got is slightly different. You know, there are deviations and expected norms. It seems they just kind of compounded to make my case a bit more involved, let's say, than for most people. Suffice to say, the process is actually the same regardless of what focusing screen you use, whatever screen you get, wherever you get it from. But the Rick Olsen screen in particular has been a huge boost to the usability of this camera for me. I've gone from struggling to really confidently focus at like f8 outdoors on a cloudy day, which is most days in Ireland, to being able to pretty confidently focus at f3.5 to f4 indoors at like portrait distance if I just take my time, mostly because of the addition of the micro prism as a focusing aid. I really struggle to focus without like a proper focusing aid, a micro prism or a split prism, and that alone has been a huge improvement and well worth the price of admission. I'll leave a link to the Rick Olsen Bright Screen website down below, but the process is the same regardless of what screen you buy, so I hope people find this video useful, and that's all I have to say for this video. So stay safe, and bye bye for now. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at Shaka1277 for new pictures every day. If you liked this video and enjoy what I do on the channel, please consider subscribing or checking out my Patreon, where the tiers start at just €1 per month.